You're taking a course about the New Testament. But what actually is the New Testament? That's what we're going to get into in this video. We're going to talk about the structure of the New Testament, what the New Testament is, how it functions as scripture for the Christian religious tradition, and some of the context and background for the New Testament. The New Testament is scripture for the Christian religious tradition. But what is scripture? So we need to take a moment to think about this and define it. Scripture is something that exists in most or all religious traditions. It begins typically as an oral tradition, something that's passed down from person to person over generations, something like a folk tale or a story that somebody's ancestors told them and they continued to pass on. However, for it to become scripture, it has to be written down. It also has to be something that's sacred or oriented towards the sacred. Now, sacred can be some kind of a confusing term. What sacred means is something other, something beyond our human selves. So, in some traditions, like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, this might be God. It's oriented towards something greater than humanity. In other traditions, such as Buddhism, it might be something like nirvana, something that's not necessarily a deity, but a greater sense of ultimate reality. And scripture also has to be authoritative. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we get to canonization. But for scripture to truly be scripture, it has to be authoritative and carry some kind of importance and weight within a religious tradition. You can't have a text be scripture in a religious tradition if most of the people in that tradition don't accept it as holding authority for their religious beliefs and rituals. When we talk about the New Testament, we're talking about not simply one book. We might think of it that way. It is part of the Bible as a whole, so we typically see the Old Testament and the New Testament together. But the New Testament is separate from the Old Testament, and not only is it separate, but it also has multiple works within it. When we think of the New Testament, it's best to think of this as an anthology, or a library or collection of works. If you pick up a novel, like To Kill a Mockingbird or 1984, you're going to have the same plot, the same characters, the same author throughout the entire text. When you pick up the New Testament, however, you're going to find that there are books or chapters, essentially, within it that don't have the same author, they don't have the same plot, they don't have the same characters. There might be some common themes or threads that connect all of these books, but that is what helps them create an anthology, not necessarily putting them together as one cohesive book. Within this anthology, there are also multiple genres. So we have some genres that are focused on providing history, and in this case, it's interpreted history. The books that we have here aren't interested in providing a history textbook account of what happened during the life of Jesus and his followers. Instead, they're showing the history from the perspective of people who follow Jesus. They might leave out details that they weren't interested in or didn't matter to them. And some people might have perceived accounts in different ways, just like if somebody in a car was driving down the street and saw something happen, or a pedestrian saw the same thing happen. Those perspectives might be different. They might have noticed different things or been able to capture different things in their memory. Let's take a look at the structure of the New Testament. There's 4 major parts that make up the New Testament anthology, and there are multiple books within each of these. The first is the Gospels. In Greek, this is euangelion, and it literally means good news. So when we have the Gospels, the writers seem to think of this as the good news of Christ and what he did for humanity, at least in the perspective of the Christian tradition. There are 4 Gospels that we find in the New Testament. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As we move into talking about the Gospel of Mark next week, you might notice that this is a little out of order from what we see in the New Testament structure. This is because Mark is believed to be the oldest Gospel. The second part of the New Testament structure is the history. While the Gospels focus on the beginnings of the Christian religious tradition, the history part, which is only composed of the book of Acts, focuses on the history and spread of the Christian tradition. This focuses on how the apostles and followers of Christ spread the tradition to different people and what that looked like. The third and biggest part of the New Testament is the epistles. Now, epistles are letters. That's what the word literally means. And we're going to find letters here written by Paul, James, and other people who were important to the early church. The epistles are essential for telling the beliefs and ethics of the tradition. And finally, we see the book of the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelation. Now, you might hear of this as a book of prophecy, but when we talk about this later in the course, we'll talk about prophecy as something that is a message from God, not necessarily predicting the end times. We'll get into those nuances later, but apocalypse simply means hidden. So we're going to talk about this hidden knowledge and what's going on in the book of Revelation when we get to that later in the course. I mentioned earlier that the New Testament is scripture for the Christian religious tradition. This is because it's gone through the process of canonization, which is essentially a process of selection. Now, this selection can happen in a sitting with a group of people deciding what is authoritative enough to be considered part of this canon and what is not. This can also happen over a period of time, perhaps with people just deciding, this book I think has a better moral message, or tells the story of Jesus better. And then over time, this canon is compiled. For the New Testament, this happens in the 4th century CE by Athanasius, who did not seem to actually intend to provide a canon of the New Testament. Up to this point, there were a lot of different texts floating around. Later in the semester, we'll read other New Testament apocrypha, or texts that are not part of the canon, such as the Gospel of Thomas, that we don't see in the actual canon of the New Testament that you might find in the book you have for this course. So Athanasius was trying to decide on an Easter date for 367 CE, and in the process was listing the books that people have been talking about for the New Testament, and it ended up becoming the canon and staying this way up until the present day. This was a process of selection, but was not necessarily explicit. And this brings me to my second point, which is that the criteria for the New Testament were also not explicit. The texts that we have in the New Testament canon are primarily written in Greek originally, although there's some Aramaic in there as well. And they also are mostly the oldest texts that we have about Jesus and his followers. However, these criteria were not explicit. Nobody sat down and said, we have to find the oldest text or find the ones that were written in Greek. We also have other texts in Greek, such as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but these obviously didn't have the same message that what we find in the New Testament has. And these texts are also considered authoritative for this tradition. So the Gospel of Thomas in some traditions is more authoritative, but for most mainstream Christianity, it's not an authoritative text. It does not carry the weight that the other texts we find in the New Testament canon do. You might think of this like the Star Wars canon. When you watch the Star Wars movies or read books or even fan fiction, you're going to find different levels of what's authoritative. And this varies from person to person. Let's take a few minutes to look at the background of the New Testament. Just like any other text or work, the New Testament was not produced in isolation. Instead, there was culture going on around it, so it's important to look at the context that this text was produced in. One of the major factors was Judaism, the religious tradition that we find in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, also called the Tanakh. Now, Judaism is the tradition that contains the Ten Commandments, the figure of Moses, and also the God Yahweh. Yahweh is the Tetragrammaton, which means that it's written in 4 letters because it's the divine name. So in an effort to preserve this tradition, you usually will find it written only with the consonants, YHWH. Judaism, for the most part, especially later on in the tradition, is monotheistic, meaning that it's focused on only one God. So this God is Yahweh and becomes the God of the New Testament as well. One of the most important texts from Judaism is the Torah, also called the Pentateuch. These are the first 5 scrolls or books of the Hebrew Bible. The books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These compose the law or teachings of the Hebrew Bible and are really important as we move forward into the New Testament, as Jesus is somebody who adheres to this Judaic religion and believes in the Hebrew Bible and the Torah. So as we move forward, we're going to find some of these themes, ideas, and even quotes from these texts brought up by Jesus and his followers. While Judaism probably has the most impact, especially on the religious beliefs of the people writing the New Testament, we also need to take a look at 2 other cultures when considering the context and culture that the New Testament was written in. We combine these typically as the Greco-Roman culture. And the first part of this, of course, is the Greek culture. Now, the Greek culture, as well as the Roman culture, is paganistic. Now, paganism does not have to be a bad word, and I think that a lot of 21st century Americans think of it that way. Paganism, rather, is associated with being polytheistic, or worshipping multiple gods instead of just one. So if you've read any mythology stories, like the stories of Hercules and Zeus, then you'll know some of these stories that are polytheistic. There are more than one god in this universe, instead of just one God, Yahweh, like we see in Judaism. Now, the New Testament, for the most part, tries to push back against these polytheistic ideas in support of a monotheistic culture. We'll see some instances of Hellenism, or being Greek. This Hellenistic empire that we see up to the time of the Roman Empire is simply the Greek Empire. The word Hellenistic comes from the Greek word for Greek. This is a photo of Corinth, and if you know anything about the New Testament, you'll know that there's 2 letters to the Corinthians in them. We'll talk about these letters later in the semester and pick up more about the Greek culture and how it impacts the person writing those letters. The other culture we want to think about is Roman culture. Now, when Jesus is born, the emperor at the time is Caesar Augustus, who's the first Roman emperor. Augustus instates the Pax Romana, or Peace of Rome, which is intended to be a 200-year period of peace, where everybody is combined under the same language and culture. Now, Roman culture, of course, like I mentioned earlier, is paganistic. This does not mean, again, that they are trying to convert other people to their religious beliefs, but simply to keep a peace by keeping everybody as the same kind of culture. We're going to see some pushback against this when we talk about the religious beliefs in the New Testament. Up until the 4th century CE, Christianity is mostly rocky when it comes to relationships with the government, or the Roman government here. When Constantine comes into power, eventually he becomes the first Christian emperor and makes Christianity legal. What we're going to be talking about in the New Testament course is going to be the things that comes before Constantine is emperor in the 4th century. So up until this point, we will see a lot of interaction with this Greco-Roman culture. Some of it will be adapting the ideas of the Greco-Roman culture, and some of it will be pushing back against those ideas. And this is a statue of Caesar Augustus, just for reference. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain what Scripture is, explain what the New Testament is, its structure, and how it functions as Scripture. So we talked about Scripture and how it's something that is authoritative, oriented towards the sacred, and written. You want to be able to talk about how the New Testament fits those criteria. You also want to be able to delve into the structure of the New Testament. We talked about the 4 major parts, and know which of the 4 Gospels was probably written first. You also want to be able to define canon and explain how the New Testament was canonized. And finally, you'll want to be able to identify some of the factors of Jewish and Greco-Roman culture and how they impacted the writers of the New Testament.